There are moments when you don't realize you're about to change. You're just there, doing what you do every day, being who you've always been. And then something happens. Something small sometimes. Insignificant to anyone on the outside. But for you, that specific second divides everything into before and after. Rafael Montero, 24 years old, a streamer with almost 500,000 followers, was live when the chat started blowing up. It was a Wednesday night like any other, the setup illuminated by the blue light of the monitors, headset around his neck, a faded gaming t-shirt he had been wearing for months because it was comfortable and the chat loved to comment on it. He was in the middle of a match, answering questions, making the usual jokes. That rhythm he had fine-tuned for years until it became as natural as breathing. Then the message appeared. "You and Lucas are more than friends, huh?" It wasn't even a question. It was a statement, tossed right into the middle of hundreds of other messages, scrolling by with the chat as if it were nothing. Rafael saw it. Of course he saw it. He read the chat with the speed of someone who had spent years learning how to multitask. And he smiled. Not a forced smile, not a nervous smile, a genuinely amused smile, the kind that appeared when he was in his element, when the joke was too good to pass up. "Bro, Lucas is my editor," he said to the camera, with that cadence his followers could recognize from a mile away. "We've been working together for 2 years. If you guys see something in that, that's your problem, not mine." The chat exploded with LOLs and hearts. Some agreed, some kept insisting, but Rafael was already moving on to the next topic. A play on the map, a joke about the rival community, something that redirected the flow of the conversation with the precision of someone who does this for a living. To anyone watching, it was a perfect non-answer. Light, quick, efficient. Rafael dealing with the chat like he always did, with humor and zero drama. But then he muted his microphone. There was a practical reason for that. He needed to say something to Lucas, who was behind the camera tweaking a stream setting. Technical stuff. A 30-second pause that sometimes happened during longer live streams. And in those 30 seconds, with the microphone muted and the camera still on, but the chat unable to hear a thing, Rafael turned to Lucas. And his face changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a breakdown or a cinematic revelation. It was something much quieter, as if the tension he had been carrying in his shoulders since the start of the stream just gave way, as if he could, for a split second, exist without the weight of being the character the chat expected. Lucas had his back turned, messing with some cable, oblivious to what was going on in the chat. When he turned around and met Rafael's gaze, he raised an eyebrow. A silent question. Rafael shook his head. "All good, just checking something." Lucas nodded and went back to what he was doing. Rafael unmuted his microphone and turned back to the camera, and his smile came back with it. Quick, automatic, perfect. The chat never saw what was on his face during those 30 seconds. But we did. But what the chat never knew, what nobody knew actually, was what it had cost to build that pitch-perfect performance. Rafael Montero was 22 when he created his channel. He lived in a tiny apartment where the rent took up almost everything he earned at a job he hated. And the idea of streaming was a low-risk gamble in a life that wasn't going anywhere particularly exciting. The first month was irrelevant. The second one too. In the third month, a clip of a reaction he had during a game went viral completely out of nowhere, and suddenly he had 16,000 followers who hadn't been there the week before. Rafael was always good with people. Not in a calculated way, he was genuinely curious about others, genuinely funny when he wanted to be, genuinely capable of making anyone feel like they were in a conversation with a longtime friend, even if it was the very first stream they were watching. What the camera did for him was something else entirely. The camera being on created a safe distance. On the other side of it, he was a persona, an amplified version of himself that had all of his social traits, but none of the things he didn't want anyone to see. On stream, Rafael didn't stay up late into the night with that undefinable weight in his chest. On stream, Rafael didn't look at the people around him and feel like he was playing a role he had written himself without fully understanding the script. On stream, Rafael was whole in a way that, anywhere else, he could never be. When his follower count hit 100,000, he quit his job. When it hit 200,000, he rented a better apartment and put together a setup that finally looked professional. When it hit 300,000, Camila Torres became part of the process. Informally at first, then inevitably, because she was the only person who could manage Rafael with the right mix of patience and pragmatism. Camila was 25, had a degree in communications, and zero patience for excuses. She had been Rafael's best friend since they were teenagers, the person who knew him before the camera, before the persona, before everything. She handled his social media, his schedule, his sponsorships, and she did it with an efficiency that Rafael could never replicate on his own. "You're good in front of the camera," she told him once when they were discussing a brand deal. "In everything else, you're an organized disaster." Rafael took it as a compliment. What Camila didn't know, what no one knew, what Rafael barely knew about himself, was that the camera wasn't just a work tool. It was also the only place where he didn't have to answer the questions that stayed silent inside his head when the blue light of the monitor went out and the early hours of the morning arrived. The setup was always on. The camera always ready, and Rafael always present in the version of himself that the chat knew. Charismatic, quick, unfiltered, unafraid. The problem was that this version had to be turned off along with the monitor, and sometimes Rafael no longer knew who was left when it went dark. Lucas Andrade entered Rafael's life 2 years ago because of a favor Camila did without thinking much about the consequences. "My friend is a video editor," she said one afternoon when Rafael was complaining about the quality of the edits he was outsourcing. "Great professional, works fast, charges a reasonable rate. Want me to ask him to send you his portfolio?" Rafael said yes, mostly to get Camila to stop talking about it. The portfolio arrived 3 days later. Technically solid, creatively clean, clearly the work of someone who understood visual aesthetics better than most of the editors Rafael had hired. He sent a message confirming his interest, and they scheduled a meeting. The first encounter was professional and dry. Lucas Andrade, 26 years old, arrived on time, presented his portfolio in person with more details, asked relevant technical questions about the type of content Rafael produced, and left with a list of specs and a deadline for a test project. He didn't try to make friends, didn't try to impress beyond what was necessary. He simply did what he came to do. Rafael, who was used to people wanting something from him besides what they were asking for, was mildly surprised. The second encounter involved a joke. Rafael couldn't remember what it was anymore, some reference to a specific game mechanic that Lucas surprisingly knew about, despite not being a gamer. The joke was good. Rafael genuinely laughed, and Lucas gave that restrained smile of someone who found it funny, but wasn't going to make a scene out of it. Small, irrelevant. But it was the first time the meeting lasted longer than necessary. The third encounter took up an entire night. Rafael had a video with a tight deadline, an important video for a sponsorship that had cost a lot to secure, and the initial takes hadn't met the standard he wanted. Lucas went to the apartment at 8 in the evening with the intention of sorting it out in 3 hours. 3 hours turned into 5. The edit got good faster than expected, but while they were reviewing the final product, Rafael asked a question about a cutting choice Lucas had made, and the answer turned into a conversation about editing theory that turned into a conversation about storytelling that turned into a conversation about absolutely nothing related to the video. It was 2 in the morning when Lucas looked at his watch. "I have to go," he said, with no real urgency. "Go ahead," Rafael agreed, also with no real urgency. But Lucas stayed another 20 minutes, and when he left, Rafael remained at the setup, sinking into his chair with an unfamiliar tightness in his chest that he chose to ignore. The pattern established itself without anyone planning it. Meetings that lasted longer than they should. Conversations that started about work and ended up in entirely different territories. An inside joke that was born in the second week and survived to this day. Nights when Lucas simply didn't leave because he was working, and Rafael never suggested he should. Over time, Lucas became a constant presence. Not intrusive, Lucas was the last person in the world to be intrusive, but constant. The kind of constant you don't realize you need until you feel the difference when it's missing. And there was something about him that no one else had. Lucas didn't want anything Rafael could offer. He didn't want exposure. He didn't want to be featured on the channel. He didn't want the doors that the follower count could open. He wanted to do a good job and, apparently, kept coming back because he enjoyed the company just as much as the work. For someone who had spent years surrounded by people who always wanted something, this was different in ways Raphael didn't try to examine. Raphael, who had built an entire life on maintaining safe distances from things that could complicate it, hadn't noticed that this distance had disappeared. But the chat noticed what he had failed to see. The rumors started with a clip. It was a regular stream, Raphael gaming, responding to the chat, doing what he did. Lucas was at the apartment that day, working in a corner while the stream was running, and at some point he stepped into the camera's field of view to show Raphael something on a screen. A fraction of a minute. A glimpse. But the chat caught it. More specifically, the chat saw the way Raphael looked at Lucas when he got close. The clip spread first in the channel's fan groups, then it hit Twitter, then other forums. Someone made a compilation of other moments, an answer Raphael had given that could be interpreted in several ways. A comment Lucas had made in a video that had that specific ambiguity the internet loves. The compilation got 300,000 views in 2 days. Raphael watched the compilation 3 times. He couldn't finish the 4th. Not because the compilation was wrong, that was the problem. The compilation wasn't particularly wrong. They were real moments, captured from real angles, and the reading people were taking from those moments was plausible. Not made up out of nowhere, not a theory completely disconnected from reality. And Raphael found himself cornered by his own truth. The strategy he adopted was the one that had worked for everything so far: humor and deflection. When the subject came up in chat, he laughed. When it came up in interviews or podcasts, he made a joke and changed the subject. When smaller streamers made speculative content about it, he ignored them publicly and monitored them privately. It was manageable. What wasn't manageable was the other thing. The thing the compilation had unintentionally touched on, which remained there, steady and persistent, no matter how hard Raphael tried not to think about it. The rumors said one thing about Raphael and Lucas's relationship. Raphael didn't know yet if that thing was true. But for the first time, he was starting to wonder. And wondering was different from not knowing. Wondering implied there was an answer. It implied there was something to be discovered rather than simply ignored. For now, Raphael preferred not to get close to that answer. The first time Raphael knew was a Tuesday at 3 in the morning. During an event so mundane it would be laughable if it weren't devastating. Lucas had stayed late editing, a bigger project with a deadline by the end of the week, which required more focused attention than usual. It was faster to stay at Raphael's apartment than to go back to his own, and this arrangement had happened enough times that it didn't need an explanation or an invitation. At 11 at night, Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch. That wasn't unusual either. Raphael's couch was comfortable, and Lucas had a specific talent for falling asleep anywhere when he was tired, without any ceremony or prior warning. Raphael had thrown a blanket over him once, and since then kept a folded blanket on the corner of the couch for these occasions. Raphael kept working until midnight, then went to the bathroom, grabbed some water in the kitchen, returned to the living room, and stopped. Lucas was sleeping on his side, leaning against the arm of the couch, his face completely relaxed in a way that only happens when someone is deeply asleep. The light from the lamp in the living room cast soft shadows. The apartment was quiet, that late-night silence that is different from all other silences, denser, more honest. Raphael froze in his tracks, and the thought that came, simple, direct, without permission, was, he looks at peace. That wasn't what broke something. What broke it was what came next, the urge, small, involuntary, immediate, not to wake Lucas. Not for any practical reason, not because it was too late for him to drive, not out of any logic Raphael could put into words. Just the desire for that scene to last. For Lucas to stay right there. For the apartment to keep that comforting quietness, that dense atmosphere that only existed with Lucas around, and which Raphael always avoided confronting because admitting its existence made everything real. Raphael went to the kitchen, not because he needed more water. He stood in the dark, with the faucet off, staring at nothing, his heart beating in a way that wasn't normal for someone just standing in a kitchen at 3 in the morning. He stood there for 6 minutes, then he went back to his bedroom, closed the door carefully not to make any noise, and lay in bed with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The thought didn't go away. It wasn't a complicated thought. It was, in fact, the simplest thought in the world, so simple that its devastation lay exactly in its simplicity. Raphael couldn't reinterpret it, couldn't turn it into something else, couldn't build a more palatable narrative around it. It was what it was. And the problem, the real problem, the problem Raphael began to understand right there, lying in the dark, with Lucas sleeping on the living room couch, was that there was no way to undo what he had realized. You can stop thinking a thought, you can't unlearn something you've learned. At 4 in the morning, Raphael finally closed his eyes. At 8 in the morning, Lucas knocked lightly on the bedroom door before opening it and announcing he had made coffee. Raphael said thanks in his normal voice. Lucas left at 10. Life went on. But that night lingered. The distance started the following week, and what Raphael did next was exactly what anyone does when they discover something that turns their world upside down, but lacks the courage to deal with the situation. What's curious is that no one who knew Raphael would have recognized what he was doing as running away. It looked like the exact opposite. Raphael didn't plan it. He didn't reach a conscious, strategic conclusion that he needed to create space between them. He simply started creating that space so naturally that it took a while before even he recognized what he was doing. In-person meetings turned into video calls with reasonable excuses. I have a previous commitment. It's better if we sort this out online. Nights that would normally feature Lucas's presence turned into nights that Raphael slowly closed off, with phrases like, "Could you just text me the material?" and "You don't need to come over today, we can just do it remotely." It was all manageable. Everything had an explanation that didn't have to be the truth. Lucas noticed. He didn't say anything right away. Lucas rarely said anything right away. But there was a different quality to his messages, an extra phrase at the end, like "everything all right over there," that wasn't in previous texts. A pause before replying to some of Raphael's messages that wasn't hesitation. It was observation. Lucas was processing something. Raphael knew it, and knowing that made everything harder, not easier. Camilla was more direct. It was a Friday, 3 weeks after the night on the couch, and she had shown up at the apartment with food because next week's schedule is a mess and we need to reorganize it before the weekend. Camilla would show up like that sometimes, without much warning, using a practical excuse that doubled as a reason to check in on Raphael. They were at the table, with open takeout containers between them and Camilla's laptop displaying the month's schedule on the screen, when she stopped typing. "What happened with you and Lucas?" Raphael looked up. Nothing happened. Why? Because you don't talk about him anymore. You used to talk about him all the time, this thing Lucas said, this idea Lucas had, that joke Lucas made. Now you just talk about editing and his work as if he were just another contractor. He is a contractor. He's my editor. Camilla held his gaze, letting the silence hang heavy between them. Raphael. Camilla. Are you okay? I'm doing great. She didn't push any further. Camilla knew when to press and when to let things go. It was part of what made her so good at her job, and part of what made her the best friend Raphael had. She dropped the subject right there, went back to the schedule, and they finished reorganizing the upcoming week with their usual efficiency. But when she left, she lingered briefly in the doorway. "If you ever need to talk about anything," she said, without specifying what, "you know you can." Raphael said he knew. He shut the door. He stared at it for a while. The apartment was quiet in a way that never bothered him before, but now bothered him far too much. The live stream happened 6 weeks after the night on the couch. It was a bigger stream than usual. Raphael had announced a special match with guests, and the concurrent viewer count was nearing 40,000 when the super chat popped up. Super chats were paid contributions that appeared highlighted in the chat. Raphael read all of them because it was the most direct way to acknowledge the people who contributed. It was part of his unwritten contract with the community. The super chat read, "Raphael, are you and Lucas dating?" 40,000 people were watching. Raphael saw the question, and for a fraction of a second, less than that, less than he would ever admit, something flashed across his face. A microscopic hesitation that lasted less than a second but was entirely too long. Then the smile returned. His usual smile, sharp and easy. "Man, that's the 10th time this month someone has sent this," he said to the camera. "Let me explain it once and for all, since apparently the previous explanation wasn't clear." And then he did something he hadn't intended to do. He elaborated. The previous version had been a quick joke and a deflection. This time, with 40,000 people watching and the super chat on the screen, Raphael started talking about the nature of male friendship, about how the internet read close relationships between men in a specific way, about how he and Lucas had been co-workers for 2 years and people needed a narrative, so they built one where it didn't exist. 2 sentences would have been enough. He used 12. The chat, possessing the collective sensitivity of 40,000 people who spent too much time online, noticed. "He doth protest too much," someone wrote. That comment was copied and replicated in various forms by another 200 comments right after. Raphael saw it. He kept the stream going. He changed the subject with surgical precision, but internally something had torn. There was a knot in his stomach that just wouldn't untie. Every time the chat mentioned Lucas's name, and the chat mentioned it a lot, because the chat always mentioned whatever you least wanted them to mention, the knot tightened a little more. After the stream, an hour later, when the chat was offline and his setup was dark, Raphael sat where he always sat after his live streams, in that specific void between the energy of being live and the silence that followed. His phone was on the desk. There was a message from Lucas. "Everything okay?" 2 words, the same question as always. But this time, with the clip of the stream likely already circulating, with his elaborate denial likely already being chopped up into screenshots and analysis, those 2 words carried an urgency that Raphael could no longer brush off. He placed the phone on the desk, face down. And he didn't reply for 11 hours. During those 11 hours, Raphael was left alone with things he had spent weeks avoiding. Not deliberately at first. For the first few hours, he kept himself busy with other things, reading, checking other messages, eating something without paying attention to what it was. The normal things people do when they're avoiding thinking. But the thought always came back. Not the thought about the live stream, not the anxiety over what people were saying online. That kind of thing he had learned to manage. It was the other one, the one that sat deeper, the one that had started that early morning on the couch, which he had tried to put in a box, and the box had stayed closed until the live stream tore it all wide open again. So Raphael let it. For the first time in months, he let the thoughts come without trying to redirect them. The first time he and Lucas had sat in comfortable silence in a car, that drive back from an event, rain beating against the glass, both of them saying nothing for 40 minutes and neither feeling the need to fill the quiet. The way Lucas talked about Raphael's work, not like a fan, not like a colleague, but as someone who genuinely understood what Raphael was trying to build. The seriousness with which he treated every project, as if it mattered to him just as much as it mattered to Raphael. The inside joke that had been going on for 2 years and was only funny to the 2 of them. And that moment, always the same moment, of mutual understanding in their eyes, too brief for any outsider to notice. That night on the couch, the kitchen in the dark. The 6 minutes, the way the apartment took on a different quality when Lucas was in it. More present somehow, more real, as if the silence had texture where before there was only emptiness. Raphael let it all settle. He didn't try to reinterpret it. He didn't build alternative narratives over it. He just allowed every memory to take up the space it deserved. It was 6 in the evening when someone knocked on the apartment door. It was Camilla. She hadn't called first. She simply showed up, carrying a grocery bag that clearly contained more things than a quick visit would justify. And when Raphael opened the door, she leaned against the frame, assessing his face before saying, "I bought ingredients to make something." Raphael stepped aside to let her in. They stayed in the kitchen for 2 hours, making food that neither was particularly hungry to eat, with the TV on low volume playing some show that neither was watching. Camilla didn't ask about the live stream, didn't ask about Lucas, didn't ask anything. But she stayed, and for the first time since that night on the couch, Raphael wasn't alone inside himself. He didn't need words, just someone present. The next day, Raphael replied to Lucas's message. He hadn't planned what to say. He stared at the "You okay?" for a few seconds and then started typing. A neutral professional message about the week's editing schedule, giving an update on one project, asking about another. Normal, clean, distant. Lucas replied within minutes with the information Raphael had asked for. And then, right before Raphael could close the chat, "Can we talk?" Raphael stared at that message for entirely too long. About what? You know about what? 3 words that Raphael couldn't ignore. They met at Raphael's apartment that afternoon because it was the only place where Raphael still felt some sense of control over his environment. Lucas arrived with his usual punctuality, but without his laptop, without any work stuff. He hesitated at the entrance to the living room, shoulders tense, before sitting down. Raphael stood near his setup, arms crossed, a posture Camilla had once pointed out as your way of being defensive without admitting you're defensive. You didn't need to answer like that on the live stream, Lucas said. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation. I answered in a way that made sense for the context. You elaborated for 2 minutes on the nature of male friendship to answer a question you'd normally brush off in 5 seconds. Raphael bit the inside of his cheek, unable to formulate a response. Lucas continued, and for the first time in 2 years, the patience that was so characteristic of him had given way to something more direct. Not anger. Lucas wasn't the kind of person to resort to anger. It was exhaustion. An honest, unfiltered exhaustion, the kind that shows up when someone has been carrying something for far too long. I'm tired, he said. I'm tired of pretending I don't see what's happening. I'm tired of being treated like I'm invisible in the parts that matter. You disappear for weeks. You reply to my messages like I'm just another work contact. And when I try to ask if you're okay, you go silent for 11 hours. I was processing the live stream. You were avoiding my message. The precision with which Lucas said that, no anger, no drama, just with the exactness of someone who had spent enough time observing to know the difference, was what broke the composure Raphael had built up for that conversation. What do you want me to say, Lucas? I want you to be honest, at least with me. About what? And Lucas, who had never forced anything, who had spent 2 years being patient in the way only highly self-aware people can be patient, finally said it straight. About what you're feeling. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences they had shared. Raphael opened his mouth, closed it. The problem wasn't that he didn't know what to say. The problem was that he knew exactly what to say and couldn't make the words come out. There was a huge difference between knowing something inside your head at 3 in the morning, in the dark, and saying that thing out loud to the person it was about. The camera had served as a barrier for years. Humor had served as a barrier. His persona had served as a barrier. Here, in that room, with Lucas standing in front of him, waiting with a patience that had turned into a demand, there was no barrier. I can't have this conversation right now, he finally said. Lucas closed his eyes briefly, swallowing his frustration. All right, he said, and he left. The door closed with a soft click. Not a slam, it just closed. And Raphael remained motionless in the center of the room, suffocated by all the words that had died in his throat. It was the middle of the night when Raphael grabbed his phone. At 2:40 in the morning, sitting on the floor with his back against the bedroom wall, the click of Lucas's door still echoing somewhere inside his chest. He opened the messaging app and clicked on Lucas's name. There was no intention of sending it. He just needed to talk, to let out the words that had gotten stuck that afternoon, that he knew and couldn't say, that were taking up the air in the apartment in a way that wouldn't let him breathe right. The audio lasted 4 minutes and 23 seconds. For the first 30 seconds, Raphael kept trying to figure out where to start, and what came out was more honest than anything he had said out loud in the last 2 years. I don't know how to talk about this because I've never talked about this out loud to anyone. Not even to myself. I think I was hoping that if I didn't name it, it could somehow not be true. But it is true, and I've known it was true since that night you were sleeping on the couch, and I went to the kitchen to get some water and stayed there for 6 minutes because I couldn't bring myself to go back into the same room as you. He didn't stop there. He talked about the 2 years, about how their intimacy had grown in a way he hadn't calculated, hadn't planned, hadn't had a strategy to deal with, because it wasn't that kind of thing. He talked about the rumors and about how the quick joke had worked for a while, but stopped working when it became necessary to believe it. He talked about the elaborate denial on the live stream and what he had felt when he did it, and the emptiness that lingered afterward. He talked about Lucas, about the inside joke that had lasted 2 years, about the comfortable silence in cars, about the way the apartment felt when he was around, about what he had felt that afternoon when Lucas left and the door had shut with that soft click that sounded so final. "I can't pretend I don't know what this is anymore," he said near the end. "And I know the way I've treated you these last few months was awful of me. You didn't do anything wrong. I was the one who was scared. I'm still scared. But the fear of losing you is greater." The audio ended. Raphael lowered his phone, rubbed his face with both hands, took a deep breath. And then he looked at the screen. The message had the sent icon. Not pending. Not saved as a draft. Sent. Raphael held his breath, his thumb paralyzed over the lit screen. The read receipt took 3 minutes to appear. Raphael didn't breathe once during those 3 minutes. 43 minutes later, someone knocked on the door. Raphael opened it. Lucas was on the threshold, wearing the jacket he wore when he went out at night. His hair slightly messy, like someone who left the house in a rush. He hesitated in the hallway, his chest rising and falling quickly, staring at Raphael with an unfamiliar expression, one that Raphael's exhausted mind took a moment to recognize as relief. "Are you going to let me in?" Lucas asked. Raphael stepped aside. Lucas walked in. He didn't head straight for the couch. He didn't head straight anywhere. He planted himself at the edge of the living room, while Raphael kept a cautious distance. Absolute silence swallowed them both. There were 2 years of unhad conversations in the silence between them. "I listened to it 3 times, Lucas finally said. Raphael didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "Not because I needed to hear it 3 times to understand. I needed to hear it 3 times because—" Lucas stopped, and it was the first time in 2 years that Raphael had seen Lucas pause to search for words. "Because I was scared it would be different from the way I've been hoping it would be for a long time." There was something in that sentence that took a second to fully land. "How long?" Raphael heard his own voice ask. Lucas let out a sound that bordered on a sigh and a laugh. "Longer than you probably want to know right now." What came next wasn't a cinematic declaration. There was no background music, no perfect line. Not the kind of moment Raphael had vaguely imagined in the early hours of the morning when he couldn't sleep and let his thoughts wander further than they should. What happened was a real conversation, with pauses. With "I didn't know how to say this" on one side and "me neither" on the other. With questions that had no immediate answers and with space for that. With the kind of honesty that's only possible once you stop trying to control what the other person will think about what you're saying. There was a moment. Raphael couldn't say exactly when Lucas said he had noticed that something had changed after that night on the couch. He didn't know what had happened inside Raphael's head, but he had felt the distance Raphael had created as something physical, like a space that suddenly appeared where there hadn't been one before. "Why didn't you say anything?" Raphael asked. Lucas looked at him with that expression of someone putting together an answer that's worth getting right. "Because it wasn't my conversation to have," he said. "It had to come from you." Raphael thought about that for a moment. What if I had never sent the audio? "Then I would have just kept waiting a little longer," Lucas said simply. "Or I would have waited forever. I don't know, but I wasn't going to force it." There was something in that sentence, in the quiet certainty with which it was said, that disarmed the last defenses Raphael was still trying to keep up. The idea that Lucas had carried this too, had waited too, had made the same cost-benefit calculation Raphael had made, and arrived at the same conclusion, that the risk was worth more than the safety. At some point, without either of them being able to say exactly when, the distance between them had grown smaller than it had been in months. Raphael looked at Lucas, really looked at him, without shields, without trying to find the perfect definition for everything, and felt the knot in his stomach that had been punishing him since that night on the couch finally unravel. It wasn't the solution to everything. There were things that would still need to be navigated. What this meant for Raphael's career, what to say publicly, what came next when the sun rose and the dawn ended, and the world woke up with its opinions and speculations. Those things were real and didn't disappear just because a conversation had happened. But the core was resolved. The truth had been spoken and it had been received. And that was, Raphael discovered right then, very different from anything he had imagined. The anguish that had accumulated for months didn't evaporate by magic. It just changed shape. It became shared, bearable. There was no kiss that night. There was no grand declaration with a soundtrack. There was recognition. the rarest thing that exists between two people, the moment when one truly sees the other, without filters, without performance, and doesn't walk away. A few days later, on a quiet late afternoon, Raphael was sitting at his stream setup. The camera was off. The microphone was muted. There was no live stream, no chat, no 40,000 people on the other side waiting for the next thing he was going to say. It was just the room, the natural light coming through the window, the setup silent and present, the way a piece of furniture is present without expectations. From the living room came the sound of Lucas working, the occasional click of the mouse, the low sound of audio playing back during an editing review. Everyday, ordinary, completely normal sounds. Raphael just listened. There was a version of himself that had spent years needing the camera on to feel whole, that had found, in the safe distance of being live, a way of existing that felt more real than actually existing. That had built a persona so good that sometimes he didn't even know where the persona ended and he began. That version hadn't disappeared. It was still there, it was still part of who he was. And it would still be part of who he'd be tomorrow and the day after. The camera would still be turned on, the chat would still be answered, the jokes would still be made. Rafael Montero, streamer with almost 500,000 followers, still existed. But he was no longer the only version, and for the first time, sitting at that setup with the camera off and the microphone muted, with Lucas in the next room, Rafael didn't miss being live. He was whole without it. The microphone's mute button sat right there on the desk, as it always had, that little object that had split Rafael's life into two worlds for years. The world with the camera on, where he was public, where he performed, where he existed in a way the chat understood and approved of. And the world with the camera off, where he was left alone with what he couldn't show. That divide still existed. It probably always would, because the camera was work, and work had its own rules and necessities, and Raphael understood that. But the difference was that the world with the camera off carried less weight now. It had less of the heavy kind of silence, the kind that oppresses you. From the living room, Lucas made a comment out loud about an editing choice, not needing an answer, just thinking out loud like he sometimes did while working. Raphael answered. They exchanged a few sentences about it, and then the silence returned. But it was the other silence, the good kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. If you've ever felt like you were playing a version of yourself that wasn't completely true, if you've ever laughed at something that hurt because it was easier than explaining why it hurt, you understand what Raphael found that late afternoon. It's not a grandiose transformation. There's no music and no perfect lighting, and it's not neatly arranged the way we imagine transformations should be. It's just the feeling of existing completely for the very first time. And it's enough. If this story touched something inside you, if any part of it resonated with something you carry too, tell us in the comments. What was the moment that split your story into a before and after? That's what we're here for. Stories that don't fit into the versions we perform for the world. If you want to keep walking this path with us, subscribe. The next story is already waiting.